All right, brothers, welcome back. This is our fourth video for Church History Part 2. Um, Today, what we're going to do is we are going to begin a series of lectures. I'm not sure if it's going to be 3 or 4 lectures that will address the first of our major topics that we're looking at in this course. If you recall, I told you that we were going to organize this course around 5 different themes, and those themes are sin and salvation, church-state relations, worship. Boy, I've forgotten the other two. That's pretty bad. I have them written over here, though. Oh, yeah. Gospel in a global context is number 4. And then the fifth one is authority. So those are our 5 major themes. We can think of these, if you'd like, as 5 different tables that you might sit at with 5 different people having 5 different conversations, but all of them part of one big party. Might be one way to think about this. So these are certainly interrelated conversations that we are having, but I wanted to spend time developing these 5 major themes. And so we're going to begin today with what is perhaps the most significant theme. It certainly is one that we really want to know well, and that is the issue of sin and salvation. What is it that Christianity has to offer to the world? Is it merely some ideas for how we might live well? Is it merely some ideas for how to be happy in this life? Is it how to make a better world? Is it how to have a good family life? All of these things are wonderful. I love them. But no, there is so much more that Christianity has to offer. At the heart of Christianity is the answer to mankind's deepest need, which is the fact that he is not just uneducated, not just a little bit messed up, but that he is truly sinful, deeply lost in sin, and in such a way that he stands in a relationship of enmity, of opposition to God. We are not in right relationship and fellowship with God. And so if we want to move forward at all, and particularly if we want to move forward into eternity in a blessed way, then we need to engage the question of sin and salvation. And so I'd like to do that. It was certainly for the Protestant Reformation a central issue. And in certain regards, it was a central issue up since the time of St. Augustine, or Augustine, if you'd prefer, in the Western Church. Certainly, the earlier church fathers had wrestled with the issue of sin and salvation, but for them, the issue was largely solved simply by appealing to the incarnation of Christ. Christ saved us in and through his incarnation. And of course, we want to say amen to that. But Augustine pushed the question further in his thinking about how sin and salvation worked. During the later Middle Ages, there were a number of Reformation movements in Europe that attempted to address a variety of, you might call them problems or challenges. That is to say, there were a number of issues that were arising within the late medieval church. That is, I'm thinking here about the church of the 1300s, the 1400s, the early 1500s. And these problems were apparent at all levels of the church. There were, for example, problems related to widespread immorality and corruption within the clergy of the church, all the way from popes at the very top, through bishops and cardinals, clerics, even monks. Right? These places that were supposed to have been set apart from the world, places where one could live without being surrounded constantly by temptations and sin. These two became places where sin and corruption and immorality existed. We don't need to go into details, although we certainly could, and it's not uninteresting, the variety of sins that existed in the late medieval clergy, but we won't go into details here. I will, however, mention that another problem that existed among the clergy, and especially here I'm thinking about the lowest level of clergy, what we might think of as parish priests. So these would be kind of your typical pastor, maybe in a village or in a church in a small town. These members of the clergy, these parish priests, small town pastors, tended to be very poorly educated. And, well, you know how it works with poorly educated pastors. They tend to have bad theology. That bad theology is passed on to their parishioners, and the results are, well, predictable, right? Among the laity, what you wind up with is a sort of a Christianity that was as much characterized by superstition and by false belief, by magic rites, by rituals, intense piety, right? Very intense piety, but not necessarily biblical piety, not necessarily biblical religion. Instead, lay people would often, for example, wear just thinking about a couple of examples here, their intense piety was often connected with things like wearing these little necklaces that had special little amulets. They were called Agnus Dei. That's the Latin phrase for the Lamb of God. And often they would take and have written out for them, if they couldn't write, they would have written out for them on a small scrap of paper. In other words, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, from John. And that paper would be wrapped up and put inside of a small amulet, and they would wear that around, and that would be a kind of protection for them against the work of the devil or against their enemies, and so on and so forth. Similarly, relics became very important. So whether these were the actual physical remains of a saintly person, or perhaps something that the saintly person owned or even touched at one point, or even something that touched a saintly person. These things would carry with them a certain element of sanctity, of holiness, and you could have those with you, and they would be special, and they would in some ways communicate more closely with God. They would perhaps act as elements of protection. So people believed in these things, and so we see a kind of superstition that grew up for lay people in medieval Europe. But alongside of that, you also get, not surprisingly, a kind of anti-clericalism. That is, the lay people look at the clergy and the church, they look at the popes and the bishops and the monasteries, and while they certainly see holy men, they also see a great deal of sin and corruption and immorality. And so there's a growing sense of something is wrong with the church, even at the same time that they have an intense piety, sometimes a superstitious piety, but an intense piety that leads them to believe in the church. And the late Middle Ages is characterized by these two things operating together. So there are problems, and problems lead to a whole series of efforts to reform the church in the late Middle Ages. And I don't want to go into too many details here. You can ask me about late medieval Reformation movements if you would like to. The only point I think that I want to make is that I want to distinguish these from the Reformation, right? Luther's Reformation that begins in the 15 teens. What we're talking about here are different kinds of Reformation movements. These might be, for example, an effort within a monastic movement or a monastic community to reform monasticism, to return to a kind of original austerity or holiness, right? The idea would be that these monasteries have become too powerful and too wealthy, and the monks have become too lax, too corrupt, and so the way to deal with that is by going back to their origins, back to the way things used to be. These were a sort of monastic reform movements, or even movements within the larger church, right? Here the effort would be to return to the early church, the practices of the early church, perhaps by getting rid of some of the developments that had happened during the Middle Ages, maybe especially all of the luxury, all of the accretions, all of the non-biblical things that had been attached to Christianity. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, these reformed efforts were connected to education, right? So if we can reform the way that people are educated, and especially the way that priests are educated, right? If we can improve their education, then we will see improvements within the church. So reform of the church is connected to education. And there are a number of different movements here. I'll just mention, I think, I'll mention a couple of them. I think I ought to do that at this point. I'll mention the Brethren of the Common Life. Brethren of the Common Life were a late medieval group. A lot of lay people in them, some priests as well, but a lot of lay people. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to join together education and piety, join them, right? This was a group that was operating in modern day Netherlands and Belgium. It spread into Germany and to some other areas as well, but mostly a northern European movement. And the reason why this is interesting is that Martin Luther was actually trained early on. He was educated by members of the Brethren of the Common Life. So this was an important educational reform movement. Another kind of educational reform, this is a bit different, but mysticism, right? There was a sort of mystical movement. There were those who said, the kind of theology, the kind of education that is being taught in the schools to our priests and theologians, what was called scholasticism, this is not good, right? It is too impacted by an attempt to reason and to control God by those reasonings, and it does away with direct spiritual life. And so mystics wanted to see a shift here. Rather than focusing on learning about God, they wanted to have direct experience with God. And I think that there's something here that's healthy, right? Learning about God is not going to get you saved, but knowing Jesus is, right? Having a true relationship with Jesus is going to be saving. And so we see something happening here that makes a kind of sense to us, perhaps. A third example of this kind of this educational reform movement that's going on is what's known as humanism. This was a very influential group. Humanists were those who said, what's gone wrong in the church and in a lot of society is that we've gotten away from good learning. And for them, good learning was classical learning. Now, by classical learning, what they meant was Latin and Greek. Latin and Greek, the classical civilizations around the Mediterranean Sea of the Greek and Roman empires. Those, they thought, were good models. And the Middle Ages they saw as kind of barbaric and primitive. The Middle Ages they saw as almost going backwards in their education. And so if we want to be educated, if we want to learn, what we need to do is we need to go back to the sources, right? Ad fontes, back to the sources. This was the way that these humanists described what they were doing. We want to get away from medieval Latin. We want to go instead to the earlier sources. And those earlier sources, they believed, would affect not just the mind, right, as scholasticism did, wouldn't just affect the mind, but it would also affect the heart. And so again, we see a similar kind of thing as is happening with mysticism, a similar sort of thing as is happening with Brethren of the Common Life. The constant refrain in this educational reform effort is to say we've only been educating the mind, and we are not educating the heart as well. And so humanists wanted to bring the heart back into it as well. Although there's a lot more that I could say here, but I'm gonna move on so we don't just get stuck and spend all of our time. Okay, so we've got these ecclesiastical church problems at all levels of the church, and we're seeking reformation in them. You notice that all of these Reformation movements focus on different elements within the church, but none of them are really focusing on the theology of the church. The assumption is that the church, the one church in Europe, is the true church. And so it's theology because it has a pope who is in, sort of leading the church, who is Christ's vicar on earth. His theology must be the correct theology. And so no one is challenging the heart of medieval theology. All that they're doing is challenging the different elements that they believe have led to the growing corruption and immorality within the church. Now, Europe during this same period, in the later Middle Ages, is undergoing a dramatic economic transformation as well. Again, we could spend a lot of time here. Let me just simplify this and say, whenever economic changes happen, there's destabilization that occurs, right? And when economic destabilization occurs, social destabilization occurs, right? So whenever changes happen, you begin to have people who aren't sure where they belong anymore. This leads to conflict, it leads to instability, and people will have a difficult time earning their daily bread, knowing where they're going to be able to get their next meal from. And this creates all kinds of problems. So late medieval Europe was struggling with this. For the first time, really, in centuries, they were feeling inflation, right? The effects of inflation was occurring. Urbanization, more people were moving to the cities. In some cases, they were being pushed out of their old traditional rural settlements and moving into the cities. So cities are growing. Cities, 50,000, 60,000. In case of a place like Paris, maybe getting up to 100,000 or something like that. Old economic relationships are falling apart. New ones are being developed, but they're only in the process of being developed, and so nobody really understands quite how they're working. But as a result of those shifts, what you begin to see is that new men begin to rise, men of humble origin, but who perhaps have some important skill or who have been able to tap into resources like humanistic education, who know about the treasures of the past, the classical past, and who can bring those to bear for the sake of someone who might hire them, right? Perhaps a prince or a nobleman or a great man. That person now becomes very important. And so this common humble man, maybe with a good education, suddenly finds himself rising, becoming more wealthy than many of the people around him who are of higher birth than him. Okay, again, lots of stuff. The point is simply economic changes are destabilizing Europe. And then we get another destabilizing element here. One of the things that happens is what we call the rise of the nation states. So previously, during the Middle Ages, whenever there was a contest between church and state, almost always the church ended up coming out on top. The church won the battle between church and state. You can think, for example, of the conflict known as the investiture controversy. Who gets to decide who's going to be a bishop, right? Who gets to appoint bishops? Kings said, oh, we should be able to do that. And Pope said, no, I'm the one who gets to appoint bishops. And when that conflict really played out, the popes were the ones who emerged. And by the 14th century, popes were saying to kings, you must do exactly what we say. And if ever you disobey us, you are excommunicated. You are out of the church. Now, that was easy to say, difficult to do, but that the popes were saying this suggested that they believed they had an authority direct from God that put them over the states. Well, that's easy to say when a kingdom is relatively weak, as all of the kingdoms of medieval Europe were, relatively speaking at least. But by the late Middle Ages, and certainly by the 16th and the 17th century, we're getting new nation states that are rising with new centralized governments that have new ways of operating, much more powerful ways. They're much more effective than their predecessors had been. And as a result of this, the old church-state settlement is unsettled, right? It falls apart. And now, instead of assuming that the church is always going to win, kings now sometimes find themselves able to assert authority over the Pope, and that had not previously been the case. Well, all of these would be connected in various ways into Luther's Great Reform movement. Because where previous reform efforts had attempted to make change, they all largely failed at promoting widespread reform. The great desire, and I think it is good for us to recognize the great desire of the late medieval church, as imperfect, as corrupt, as immoral as it could be. The great desire for the church was reform. Reform, as they said, in head and members, both top and the bottom, right? All the way from the Pope down to the common layperson. They wanted to see Reformation happen, but bringing Reformation to the church was very, very challenging. All right, let me come back to the idea of humanism. I want to say a couple more things about humanism because it's so important and because it plays directly into the issue of sin and salvation. So, as I said, humanism was basically an educational movement that seeks to return to the sources of classical literature, to go, as I said, ad fontes, and they wanted to imitate the very style of classical literature. Now, the reason why this is important is because while these classical scholars, right, these humanists or Renaissance men, as they sometimes saw themselves, as these humanists first began to study classical literature, that meant first studying Latin, right? So they went back and they read the Latin of, guys like Cicero, Cato, Seneca, great Latinists from the classical past during the Roman Empire. But then, having learned Latin, many of them would then go on and learn Greek as well, the second great language of the classical past. And then, many of them having learned Latin and Greek, some of them would go on and learn Hebrew as well, the third great language of the classical Christian past, right? Not just Latin and Greek, but you also want to be able to read the Old Testament. And so really now for the first time in centuries, I mean, the better part of 1,000 years, you begin to have a large number of people in Europe who can read the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament, and read them in their original languages. In fact, humanists made a practice of careful reading of original sources. This is eventually going to develop into what we call textual criticism, trying to determine what the original text said. And this is both for the Bible and for all sorts of other texts as well. What the original text said, right, and what it meant. So what it says are, the copies that we have of the original document, true copies, and what does it mean? Right? What does it actually mean? It has perhaps been interpreted one way, but is that actually what the document means? So they focus on what does the document actually say and what does it actually mean. This would lead, of course, to the rediscovery of the Church Fathers, as well as the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, this movement, humanism, is slow to spread. It's really kind of an insider movement. That is, it's a movement for well-educated folks who are interested in talking to one another. Indeed, most of what is written by the humanists is written, at least in the later Middle Ages and into the 16th, even into the 17th century, it's written in Latin or Greek or Hebrew, right? They're writing in these original languages. This means that it's not going to trickle down to common people very easily. Now, this wasn't always the case. Some of the Renaissance humanists saw that it was very important, for example, to get the Bible into the hands of common people in a way that they could understand. Well, I've spent a good deal of time laying the foundation. Let's think now specifically about sin and salvation. And I'm going to take us here a little bit before the Reformation to lay the foundation for what happens during the Reformation. Mentioned earlier that St. Augustine was probably the most significant figure here, and so it's no coincidence that Augustine, who writes in Latin, would be one of the people who is rediscovered in a significant way during the growth of humanism and during the Reformation. Well, one of Augustine's many controversies that he was involved in was what was known as the Pelagian controversy. Pelagian controversy was a controversy that unfolded around a man named Pelagius. We don't know much about Pelagius. We think that he was British of some sort. If you ask people from England, they will assure you that he was Irish, but nobody seems to want to own Pelagius, right? And that is largely because Augustine thoroughly trounced Pelagius, right? He so thoroughly defeated him in debate that no one wants to own Pelagius. No one wants to identify with him. I cannot think of a single theologian who has openly said, I am a Pelagian. Right? So the Pelagius controversy develops as a result of one of the great books that Augustine wrote. And several of you have read his Confessions. And so you know that within the Confessions there is a prayer. In fact, the entire Confessions is written as a prayer to God. But there is a specific prayer where Augustine says, Lord, command what you will, and then grant what you command. Command whatever you will, but if you command something, you're going to have to grant it to me, because I can't do it on my own. Well, when Pelagius heard this, right, when he heard that Augustine had written this, he couldn't believe it. It seemed completely impossible that someone as godly as Augustine would say that sort of thing. Pelagius said, God would never command us to do something that was not within our power. If we couldn't do it, God wouldn't ask us to do it, right? Because Pelagius believed that human beings aren't that bad. They're not so deeply sinful that they can't simply stop sinning. In fact, salvation, according to Pelagius, could be achieved without any help from God. The only thing that you need to do is stop sinning. Just be perfect. So, brothers, if you want to be a Pelagian, all you have to do is stop sinning. This may explain why no one wants to be a Pelagian, because no one can just stop sinning, right? I've tried. It doesn't work very well. Now, Augustine said that before we can stop sinning, right, before we can turn to God, God has to come first. God has to do something first in our hearts. This is usually called prevenient grace, right? Prevenient simply means grace that comes before. Grace that comes before. Prevenient grace. God must work first because human beings are inherently sinful as a result of Adam's fall. Something happened in Adam's fall that was passed along to all of his progeny, all of his descendants. There is a corruption that we receive, right? A brokenness, a marring of the image of God, such that even when we try not to sin, we continue to sin in any case. Now, this becomes known as original sin. Original sin is that stain, that taint, that brokenness, that inclination to sin that is passed from Adam to all of his descendants. Well, as I say, Pelagianism was soundly defeated and in fact was condemned by a council. And so you would think that, we've sort of dealt with that. Everyone recognizes that God must work first. But people found this difficult to accept. They didn't really like Augustine's solution. That is, that God must work first, that he must do something in our own hearts before we are going to turn to him. That in fact, it can't be reliant on us. Our salvation can't be reliant on us. It must be reliant upon God, and therefore must, in some sense, entail a sort of predestination. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit later. I don't want to go down that road quite yet. So there arose, in the wake of the Pelagian controversy, a second controversy known as semi-Pelagianism, right? A semi-Pelagian controversy. And here there is a distinction between the beginning of faith and growing in faith. So the way that the semi-Pelagians, or sometimes we call these semi-Augustinians, people don't really like semi-Pelagianism as a term anymore, so semi-Augustinian if you want, either way. What they would say is, oh, sure, of course, right? In order to first turn to God, we must have God work in our hearts. So the beginning of faith must come from God. He must implant within us a seed of faith. But growth in faith, the actual working of our faith, that's what we do, right? We do the work of faith. So God acts first, and he begins to work in you, but then you must cooperate with that grace, right? Cooperate with that grace. Now, both Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism were technically condemned by the 6th century in church councils. Nevertheless, the medieval view of sin and of salvation was by and large semi-Pelagian. By and large, semi-Pelagian. And I'd actually go a little bit further. I think large portions of the church today, certainly in the West, and I imagine in many other parts of the world as well, remain basically semi-Pelagian in their approach, which is unfortunate. All right. So do we want to say, yeah, we'll say just a little bit more here about that. The reason why I say that the medieval church was, by and large, semi-Pelagian in its view of sin and salvation is that the medieval church developed an understanding of faith, which was that God gave faith to people, but faith was given in an unformed form. Right? It was, if you want to think about it, it was kind of like a vessel. Okay? So like a cup. It was like a cup. Faith is unformed in the sense that it's not yet filled up with love. In order for faith to be saving faith, it must be formed faith. That is, it must not merely be a matter of belief, it must entail action as well. Love, right? Faith is formed, as they said, by love. Faith is formed by love. So the vessel of faith must be filled with love, that is, with good works. Because, drawing from the book of James, faith without works is dead. And dead faith doesn't save anybody. So God's grace, of course, is there continually in the medieval church for you to draw upon. It's available to help you as often as you want it. You can go and you can receive the sacraments. You can participate in the Mass. You can, even by attending and watching the Mass. This was a way of building up faith, of giving you grace to strengthen you. You could participate in pilgrimages. You could have relics. You could do all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, you must cooperate with God's grace in order to have living, that is, saving faith. Now, having talked about the grace that is constantly available, I want to just very briefly here mention baptism. Right? Baptism, which the vast majority of medieval Christians, of course, received as infants, baptism was understood to do away, to remove, to eliminate most of the effects of original sin. Here is another way in which the medieval church didn't believe that the sinfulness, the inherent sinfulness of human beings was all that bad. It was kind of limited in that baptism did away with most of it, right? Once you were baptized, they believed, all of the guilt associated with original sin was removed. It was gone. So was all of the punishment that was due as a result of original sin. So if you died immediately after being baptized, you would go straight to heaven. Wonderful. The problem is most people didn't die right after being baptized. Instead, they continued to commit sins. And those sins, those ongoing sins, had to be addressed in some way. They had to be addressed by orally confessing them to a priest, by performing good works, we call these works of penance, in order to atone for them, to deal with the punishment that was due for them. And if you failed to do that, if you failed to pay those penances, that meant that you would have to spend time after death in a place of purgation, in a place of suffering where the punishment for that sin was being dealt with. And that was called purgatory, a stop in the afterlife on the way to heaven. So if you got into purgatory, in some ways that was good news because you knew that you would eventually get to heaven, even if it took you, 1,000,000 years or something. There was hope because you always knew that you were going to heaven eventually. One other thing to point out here is, in addition to confession, penance, and purgatory, there was in the late medieval church also the option of indulgences, which of course becomes an important part of Luther's story. So, by way of summary here, bringing this all together, how bad are we, right? How bad are we? How deep is our sin? We've seen three really different answers to that question. Augustine's answer, total depravity, inherent sinfulness that spreads throughout our whole person. Our entire will is bent towards sin and cannot turn towards God in its own power. Pelagius says we're not inherently sinful at all. Our sinfulness is largely just the result of having bad examples, of forming bad habits. Our will is not bent towards sin. Instead, it's free to do whatever we want. And if we turn it towards God, and if we do good, and if we stop sinning, then we will have achieved salvation. Semi-Pelagians fit in the middle there. We're really bad, but we're not totally depraved. With the gracious help of God, we can do good works that are pleasing to God. We can move towards Him. And if we do our best, then God will do the rest. That's all that God expects for us in salvation, for us to do our best, or as some of the medieval theologians would put it, to those who do what is in them, God will not deny His grace. Just do what is in you. God will not deny your grace. Now, we're going to see that Luther has problems with that, major problems with it. I hope that you do as well. We'll take that up next time. God bless you, brothers.